Much of what we are in Western countries, in one way or another, can be explained by the impact of the Enlightenment, the 18th century movement of ideas which proclaimed the power and superiority of human reason to explain and shape human reality. Well, according to our next guest, despite the global effect of the Enlightenment, our capacity to reason is well undermined by the power of our instincts and emotions. Can we learn to become more rational? Here now, to help answer that, University of Toronto philosophy professor Joseph Heath. He's the author of Enlightenment 2.0, Restoring Sanity to Our Politics, Our Economy, and Our Lives. And Joseph, good to have you back at TVO.
Thanks for having me.
Not at all. I want to start by just quoting from a column that you recently wrote during this most recent Ontario election campaign, which we'll talk a bit about. You did this for the Ottawa Citizen. Indeed, our everyday vocabulary, which includes concepts like lying and confabulation, simply lacks the resources to articulate what's going on here. These campaign claims are so far removed from the practice of truth-telling that they can only be described as post-truth, part of a new game in which none of the ordinary rules apply. Okay, we need to know more about what this post-truth means. So tell us.
Right. So my central motivation for writing the book was to talk about the current political environment where, I mean, there are a lot of people who have been expressing a lot of concern about the way in which our political discourse has been going. And I mean, so I don't want to sound naive. I mean, there's no question that there's always been spin and politicians have lied for various purposes and reasons. But that there is a growing sense that things have gotten a little further out of control. And that something needs to be done about it. And so actually in the book, I take as my point of departure Jon Stewart's rally to restore sanity, where he actually, brought together 250,000 people to Washington in order to try to basically, restore some level of sanity to American political discourse. So that's part of the general sentiment that's out there. And I think that the central concern is not that people are sort of telling specific little lies in order to gain advantage, but that rather there's a fairly sustained effort to kind of shift political discussion completely outside the framework of rational argumentation, and to have a political discourse, particularly during campaigns, that's entirely based on these appeals to emotion or to people's sort of instinct or gut.
But I think if I read right, you think we're complicit in some of this as well, right?
Yeah, I don't want to blame entirely the purveyors of truthiness. One of the other things about the book is that I don't blame the media that much. I think that in many ways there's not that much the media can do. I mean, we could sit there and we could have like a university seminar, and newspapers could print 8-page articles full of statistics and information, but people have to read it. And you can lead a horse to water, but you can't necessarily make him drink. And so this is something that is part of, a general sort of drift within our society, in which like the consumers of information, the purveyors of information, and politicians are all kind of mutually complicit.
Then let's talk more specifically about this past Ontario election campaign to see if we can find some examples of what you're referring to. For example, let's start with this. In your view, did the four main political parties, Liberals, Conservatives, New Democrats, Greens, all engage in post-truths, or truthiness, if you like the Colbert expression, to the same extent?
I don't think they did, and one of the controversial claims I make in the book is that the commitment to the post-truth style of politics right now is much stronger on the right of the political spectrum than it is to the liberal left. So you see it most strongly with the Republican Party in the United States, and you see it with the progressive conservative parties as well, where there's a really, really consistent type of communication strategy that's been developed. Which is really strongly committed to this whole bypassing of the truth idea. And so you can see it with the Progressive Conservative campaign in Ontario. I mean, it wasn't just something like the Million Jobs Plan, where it was pretty clear that had been picked for communications purposes. And then later they sort of got a junior analyst to try to come up with some numbers, and they didn't sort of take the job very seriously. And so they got a little bit embarrassed by the fact that people started complaining about their math. And it suggested that they really hadn't expected anybody to pop the hood and to look that carefully at where this number had come from. They were running the entire campaign on a set of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like we all know what the game is, right? Which is that, we've picked a number which is going to stick in your mind, which is going to seem really appealing, which is going to communicate our message, which is that we care about jobs. And then the details are like, not so worried about the details, right?
There was an ad that the Tories ran right near the end of the campaign, which was called The Truth.
Yeah.
And Tim Hudak looked right in the camera, very earnestly, I have to say, with a lot of sincerity, and said, you know, a lot of people are going to give you the spin. I'm going to tell you the truth. The truth is, 1 million people in this province wake up every day without a job looking for work. Now, right away off the top, that wasn't true. But they said it anyway.
Yeah.
How come?
Yeah, so that's why I think our vocabulary is inadequate to describe this. This is why people start talking about post-truth, because it's sort of wild putting together a campaign ad called The Truth that has as its central premise, you know, one's tempted to say a lie. I mean, that is, there were about 500,000 people in Ontario who were unemployed in the sense that they were looking for work. Now, I suppose if you count children and senior citizens, you could say there are 1 million people, right? But, you know, by any standard definition, the statement was not true, right? So, you know, to have a campaign ad called Truth that features as its central premise a lie is not, you know, lying doesn't really capture that, right? That's just moving totally outside the realm.
I want to call it a lie, or is it an exaggeration for like some poetic license in a campaign?
That one you could say is an exaggeration developed with the intent to mislead, I suppose.
Well, mind you, having said that, they had this caucus meeting not too long ago at Queen's Park. The Tories did. I mean, from what I heard, it was a real bun fight behind closed doors for a few hours as they had this serious post-mortem on what went wrong during the campaign. But then Tim Hudak came out afterwards and he said, whatever you thought of what Hudak stood for, you know I believed in it, you know I fought for it, you know I had fire in my belly. He lost, but he came across as sincere. He did lose, but he came across as a guy who really believed what he was selling. It just didn't sell. Is sincerity an argument against your charge of politicians dabbling in post-truths?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think you could see in the Progressive Conservative campaign the post-truth strategy figuring in all kinds of different ways. I mean, not just in the specific economic claims that became controversial, but if you look, for example, at the way in which in the leaders' debates, the way Tim Hudak, I mean, the strategy that he was pursuing, is that there were at least 4 or 5 times in response to a question, he would personalize an issue by picking up a little story. And so he would say, oh, you know, when I talk to my daughters at home, you know, my daughter asked me this question, right? Or I remember when my grandmother lost the family farm, or what have you, right? Or I remember when there was a special needs kid who went to graduation, and so I don't remember any of the details of the little stories.
But they were designed to tug on the heartstrings.
And the other leaders were not doing that, right? He was doing that specifically. Now, it's noteworthy that in all the cases, I mean, I watched this thing on television, there was some noise going on and so I don't actually remember what the policy issue was that he was discussing in any of those contexts. But I remember the stories vaguely. I mean, you can see, like, I kind of impressionistically remember them.
Sure.
Because telling little stories like that exploits a certain kind of bias in human cognition, which is that when something's associated with a person and with a story, it sticks in your mind. And when you present something in terms of numbers and policies, it doesn't stick in the mind in the same way. So that was the strategy. Now, it wasn't as well executed as other people are capable of executing it. And so in part, actually, when a strategy is not well executed, you can actually see the strategy more clearly, right? Because he's not as good at it, right? Like Bill Clinton was really good at it. So it never seemed like a strategy because you believed him when he told these little stories. Whereas Tim Hudak was not as good at it. And so it came, I thought it came across as insincere. Maybe because I spend too much time reading stuff about how these strategies work.
Tim Hudak, if you met him, is a guy you'd want to have a beer with. Didn't necessarily translate on television, but if you met him, like we're chatting right now, he's a very pleasant guy to have a beer with. I thought we lived in an age where the guy who you wanted to have a beer with was the guy who got your vote. Not anymore?
I thought so too. It's just you have to be, I think, just a little bit better at carrying it off, the political strategy. I mean, I think that if he had been able to, I mean, that's what everyone says about Tim Hudak, right? It was, you know, off camera, he's this total mensch. And then as soon as you put him in front of the camera, he becomes sort of robotic. And now, I think that in many ways, I mean, that's why I was sort of very anxious. I mean, look, I mean, I was sort of deeply alarmed by the actual political program that they were advancing as well. So I'm not going to pretend I'm unhappy that they lost. But I was deeply concerned at the strategy that they were carrying out, because it is a strategy which has been shown to work in many political contexts, right? Which is, you know, rather than spouting facts and figures, you tell a little story, you know? And this was really pioneered by Ronald Reagan. And in the United States, there are many politicians who are capable of carrying it off very, very effectively. Now, I think that if Tim Hudak had been able to take his real personality and execute the strategy with the resources that are apparently available to him of being like a good old guy, then I think the strategy would have worked far more effectively than it did. It's just that, it doesn't work if you sound insincere.
It's not a sin not to be as good as Ronald Reagan at doing that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
he was really good at that.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it as well. I mean, certain strategies, like when Sarah Palin first got involved in U.S. politics, she was, on the national scene, she wasn't very good at it. And so you could see some of the underlying machinery showing through. So, for example, she was very poor at executing talking points. And so, so again, part of the talking point strategy is this thing of someone asks you a question, you don't answer the question. You already have a list of things you want to say.
You say what you want to say.
And you pivot to the talking point. You pick your talking point, and then you deliver it, right? Now, when someone who's good at it does it, only the poor interviewer realizes that the question has not been answered. The viewer is like, oh, isn't that interesting? It's like you follow the pivot, right? Whereas someone like Sarah Palin in the early days wasn't very good at it. So you could see the machinery, right? She'd be pivoting, but it would be this kind of wild free association. And then she wouldn't feel very good about it. So she'd pivot to the next talking point. And so a lot of the stuff that she got made fun of was because she wasn't very good at executing a strategy. That doesn't mean the strategy doesn't work. That just means you need, a better person she got better at it over time. Right?
You referenced a few minutes ago the really quite significant rally held 4 years ago in Washington by Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, those late night funny guys. It was called the Rally to Restore Sanity. And 250,000 people showed up. And we got a clip of that. Let's show this clip and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would, roll tape.
Most Americans don't live their lives solely as Democrats, Republicans, liberals, or conservatives. Americans live their lives more as people that are just a little bit late for something they have to do. Often something they do not want to do, but they do it. Impossible things every day that are only made possible through the little reasonable compromises we all make. Because we know instinctively as a people that if we are to get through the darkness and back into the light, we have to work together. And the truth is, there will always be darkness. And sometimes the light at the end of the tunnel isn't the promised land. Sometimes it's just New Jersey.
If he's not reading off a teleprompter there, that is a hell of a performance. Boy, can he riff. What was the significance, in your view, of what those two guys accomplished on that day?
Well, that speech we just saw, I actually think is one of the finest political speeches that's been delivered in the past decade in American politics, in that he actually articulated the central idea of liberalism in a way that I haven't seen an American politician articulate in a long time. I mean, so the traffic analogy was, he started out by saying, look, this is like merging in traffic, right? I mean, we're all trying to get somewhere, and we don't have to agree about where we're going, but we can agree to take turns, you go, I go, you go, I go, right? So, I mean, that's actually articulating a deep truth about the way in which modern societies function, which is that we can, the way, for example, that multicultural societies function. We can deeply disagree about all kinds of questions, and yet we can still, take turns, cooperate in ways that are mutually beneficial, right? That enhance everyone's quality of life. But that kind of insight, this idea that, even though you really want to get where you're going and you think that's the most important, you might want to give way to someone else who is going somewhere else and so on. That's ultimately a rational insight. That's not something that viscerally feels great. I mean, making those kinds of compromises is not the kind of thing that instinctually we're wired up to do.
But we've already discovered that campaigns are about the appeal to the gut, not necessarily to the head.
So that's often presented as a discovery. And one of the things I try to argue in the book is that it shouldn't be regarded as a discovery or as just a fact of nature. It's a situation that we have allowed to develop. Now, whether or not it's reversible or not is not clear to me. But there's no question that 40 years ago, campaigns were less like that. 40 years previous, they were even less like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, so there's been a trajectory of development. And, you can see similar things going on with advertising and commercial speech, right? So if you look at an ad in a newspaper from the 19th century, It's like a paragraph saying, the ladies and gentlemen of the community are invited to assess the quality of this new product being offered to you and so on. It's very discursive, right? And then ads become, over the course of the 20th century, less discursive and less argumentative, to the point where now often they're just photographs and there's no language, no text there at all. And we've seen something similar. I mean, political strategy and advertising tends to lag commercial advertising by about a decade. But we've seen a similar development where political speeches have gone from, Lincoln used to give 3-hour speeches and people sat around and listened. I mean, partly they had nothing better to do. They had no television to watch and so on. But people used to sit for hours and listen to political speeches. Now, I'm not suggesting that we could go back to that right now, but there's no question that we have allowed things to change. And that the environment in which political campaigns are entirely based on appeal to heart and not head is a consequence of choices that we've made as a society.
But let me pick up on one of the points that Jon Stewart made in that clip, which is we don't wake up every day, if we were in Canada, we'd say, as liberals or conservatives or New Democrats or Greens. And yet the numbers don't quite bear that out. Pew, the research agency, did a study and did find that Americans are becoming increasingly polarized. And if you look from 20 years ago to today, the share of people in the states who express consistently liberal or consistently conservative opinions went up from 10% to 21% over that period. So that country is becoming increasingly, people do wake up every day thinking, first and foremost, I am a conservative, I am a liberal. So where does that get us in this effort that you're trying to point out?
Well, the United States is a bit of a special case. Like in almost everything, the United States is always a bit of an outlier and a bit of an exception. I mean, so the fact that they didn't have the same kind of strong partisan affiliations 20 years ago, 30 years ago, is partly an artifact of the American South and Southern Democrats and all these sort of complicated, features of the American political system. And so I don't think that as Canadians we necessarily need to draw lessons from that. The way in which the political system in the United States is currently organized generates political polarization. The way in which our political system is organized, both historically and in the present, generates regional polarization, for example, right? And so if you can start a party in a region, you can get some seats and get your issue on the agenda.
Bloc Québécois.
But if you're the Green Party and you want to organize something about an idea, but it doesn't have a specific regional focus, then you have a lot more trouble getting on the radar.
Yeah.
So we have a political system that encourages regional polarization, not necessarily political, ideological polarization. So I don't think that necessarily says anything deep about our society and our culture. So a lot of it is actually an artifact of how the political system works. The good news then is that if you don't like the way it's going, you can always fiddle the political system so that it encourages different I mean, people are going to find something to fight over, and the idea of a democracy is that it's a competition for political leadership. So we want there clearly to be some axis of competitiveness where people are genuinely disagreeing politically. But we, again, as we're not just passive observers to these trends. They're often a consequence, again, of decisions that we've made, right, of how we choose to organize our institutions.
You know Jonathan Haidt?
I know him by reputation.
He wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. He was on our program not too long ago talking about it. We'll play a clip. We'll come back with a question. Roll tape, please.
My early research was on how people make moral judgments, and I would give people moral dilemmas or moral scenarios in which someone did something, let's say, gross but harmless, like a family that ate its pet dog and after it was killed by a car in front of their house. And people would generally have an instant reaction. They know it's wrong, they react with disgust, and then when I would cross-examine them and try to get them to say why it's wrong, they would often hem and haw and say, well, I can't really think of a reason, I just know it's wrong. So I put this together with a lot of other research that was happening in the 1990s, showing that our minds are pattern matchers that make very quick judgments, within a second usually, and then we recruit our reasoning afterwards to justify what we've just done. So the metaphor I used in my previous book, The Happiness Hypothesis, was that the mind is divided into parts, like a rider on an elephant. The rider is our conscious reasoning. It's pretty small and impotent, but it acts like it's in charge. And the elephant is the other 99% of the mind, which really runs most of our behavior.
What do you think of the metaphor?
So the metaphor is fine, but I very strongly disagree with his view of morality, because in his view, the morality all comes from the elephant. That is, your values, your moral judgments, they all come from the gut or from the level of instinct. And reason is this kind of extra thing that we tell a little story to ourselves about, why we make these moral judgments. Now, when you apply that politically, what it suggests is that, from left to right of the political spectrum, everybody's just got these non-rational commitments. And all they're doing is kind of pushing those commitments and trying to get a majority around them. And so political communication is, again, the rational part of it is just kind of window dressing. What you're really trying to do is to articulate your values. Now, what I've suggested, and I think what Jon Stewart was getting at with, again, in his speech, is the fact that it's not the case that all political positions are equally non-rational. That some political positions, some values or moral judgments actually require a moral insight into the structure of a problem. And compromise is the best example of this, right? So we all have where we're going, which may be dictated by our values, right? Our most fundamental sense of what's right and wrong. But the fact is other people disagree with us. And what are you going to do at that point in time? You could fight about it, you could argue about it non-productively, or you could come up with some insights as to how you're going to compromise with those other people. You could agree to take turns, right? Now, that's an insight which is available, and it's not a non-moral insight, right? That's a moral idea, right? That commitment to compromise comes from recognizing the fact that people disagree. So, for example, if you look at the heart of the way a multicultural society functions, for example, people have these deep commitments that come from their religion and their ethnic background, which are very strongly felt. But they recognize that, Canada's not going to be a Christian republic, right?
So we tend not to fight about that stuff.
And so we're going to agree to individual rights, principles of tolerance, principles of equality, that's how we're going to organize our society. Now, so it's really important to recognize that those rational insights, if you put them into an environment, a political environment, where everybody is just making these gut-level appeals to values, those more rational commitments are going to suffer because we don't feel them viscerally, the way in which we feel the sort of more tribal loyalties that we have, for example.
Jonathan Haidt seems to suggest, though, that he has research which indicates that our political preferences are almost genetically encoded. Do you think there's something to that?
No, I think that's really absurd. I think that, but there are certain predilections that people have, which no doubt have an instinctual or genetic basis. So, for example, I think retributiveness, right? So when you see someone do something wrong, you want to punish that person. That is a human universal, and I think it undoubtedly has a biological basis. But what you do with that in society, that's very much an open question. Right? So retributiveness is extremely effective as an instinct when it comes to organizing cooperation in a very small-scale society, where you know everybody and you know who's doing their part and who's not doing their part. But once you start getting more complex societies, it can generate things like blood feuds, right? And the tit-for-tat retaliation can, in fact, in a larger-scale tribal society, can actually function as a huge impediment to social cooperation. So one of the things that we do in modern societies, for example, is that we tell individuals that they're going to have to take their retributiveness and they're going to have to accept some water in their wine or whatever. They're going to have to moderate that because now, once you enter into a large-scale society with a state, you no longer have a private right of vengeance. If someone commits a crime against you, that's an issue that basically the police arrive and the state takes over. And the state punishes. I mean, criminal prosecutions are brought by the state, not brought by individuals. So what we ask in a modern society is for individuals to take that instinct that they have and, moderate it somewhat. And I think different people have different degrees of success in moderating that.
Do you think?
So, for example, I think a lot of the appeal of many conservative positions on crime is that they appeal to people who have a really, really strong retributivist impulse. Mm-hmm. And they feel that criminals are just not being dealt with as harshly. And other people, sort of more whatever, progressive or liberal, are less concerned about retributiveness and so on. So there's an instinctual sort of underlying aspect to the political positions. But the fact is that, that the biology is not destiny in this area, that our society requires that all of us accept some moderation of that retributive impulse.
Do you think left and right are equally open to rational argument?
I don't think so, because I think that that government that government is sort of the ultimate agent of collective action in our society. And so whenever we have a very, very large-scale problem that we need to deal with, Private markets are typically not very strong at dealing with it. So you take a problem like global warming or something like that. We need to organize cooperation on a very, very broad scale. And so we turn to government to do that. But also, whenever we're trying to organize cooperation on a very, very large scale, we also need to accept a huge amount of compromise. And so often, that understanding the case for the government's role in resolving a particular problem requires a kind of rational insight. And therefore, it is not a viscerally satisfying sort of intervention. So let me give you an example, like something like, the fact that there's congestion and nobody can get anywhere in Toronto and transit and all this kind of stuff.
Road tolls is the example.
So, the argument for public transit requires a certain kind of rational insight. And that rational insight is based on the following, which is that people don't have to get into their car in the morning. Like the number of vehicles on the road is not fixed, it's not a constant. And that the average person actually has a significant degree of flexibility in how many trips they make. And so if you make roads free, people are going to use roads too much. And so if you first of all price roads and then provide alternatives, you can actually reduce congestion.
Which sounds like a conservative market solution.
Well, it's a solution which has been rejected by conservative parties in Canada, right? And so they've chosen to treat road pricing as taxation and then to be opposed to it on the grounds that it's taxation. So look, what I want to say is that when Rob Ford campaigns in Toronto and says, I'm going to end the war on the car, that has visceral appeal. Because when you're in traffic, the schema that you naturally apply to it is the tribal one. There's us guys in our cars, and then there's these other people on bikes, and then there's those other people who ride transit, and so you divide the world up into us and them, and then you feel as though what's going on is a war between us and them, and that we're losing. So Rob Ford's on our side. All right, so framing it as in terms of a war on the car is a very viscerally compelling way of framing it. Whereas, for a liberal to come along and say, well, those people in cars don't necessarily have to be in cars. They could be on transit, and then there'd be fewer cars. And you're giving this kind of complicated explanation. That has no visceral appeal. It sounds technocratic and so on. So I think that of those two political positions, they actually don't have the same level of emotional appeal. So if you create a political environment where emotion rules over reason, what you're going to have is more congestion because that emotional way of framing the question is the one that's going to win.
The time has flown by. We've got about a minute left. I want to try one more thing with you. The world is changing faster and faster, and yet you, in your book, are counseling the need to slow down and think and reason together. Would you agree that this does not feel on the surface like a world that's about to slow down so that we can reason a little more effectively together?
Yeah, I end the book by saying what I recommend or what I would like to see happen. I don't make any claims about how likely any of this is to happen. But what I do suggest is and by talking a little bit about the social conditions and the environmental conditions that allow us to reason more effectively, what I want is for us sort of collectively to think then often about the consequences of this for political debate, for example, right? So at the moment, politicians are really getting a lot of pressure to be on Twitter. Right? Twitter is one of these technologies, that it tends to accelerate discussion and abbreviate discussion. There's been a kind of old fuddy backlash against that, but I want to give that a more principled basis where I want to say, let's stop and think about this, right? Like, do we really want MPs in the House of Commons tweeting back and forth to each other? Is that going to enhance the rationality of political discourse? To ask the question is to answer the question. No, right? And so I think that...
I don't know. I think it's kind of cool having direct access to a cabinet minister via Twitter.
I think that's totally cool as well. Yeah. But I think that, for example, the fact that political debate is now being conducted on Twitter, that newspaper stories are being generated by, oh my God, look at this thing that happened on Twitter last night. That can't be
different story. Joseph, we're really glad you came into TVO tonight. We want to remind everybody your latest is called Enlightenment 2.0, Restoring Sanity to Our Politics, Our Economy, and Our Lives. And we hope you've restored a little sanity to our programming on TVO tonight. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.